Ladies and gentlemen, have you noticed how some of the most dangerous warnings do not arrive with thunder? They do not split the sky open in one violent moment, and they do not always announce themselves through floodwater, fire, or falling concrete. Sometimes they enter much more quietly than that. They slip into the body before they ever reach the headlines. They settle into the lungs, the nerves, the rhythm of sleep, and the private fatigue people struggle to explain even to themselves. That was how it began in the Keller house outside Baton Rouge. At 4:12 in the morning, the air conditioner was still running. The thermostat still read 67. The vents were still pushing cold air through every room. And yet, when Rachel Keller opened her eyes, she felt as though she had spent the entire night inside a sealed truck baking in summer heat. Her throat was dry. Her heartbeat felt wrong. Her arms were heavy in a way sleep was supposed to cure, not create. Across the hall, her husband Daniel sat on the edge of the bed rubbing his chest, not in pain exactly, but in that strange gray zone people rarely know how to describe. Their son woke up angry. Their daughter woke up crying and said the house felt too tight, as if the walls had moved inward while they slept. By sunrise, Daniel had heard the same complaint from two men at work. One lived in Gonzales, one in Prairieville. Both said nearly the same thing. The room was cold, but the body never rested. By noon, Rachel had heard it from family in Houma and Gulfport. The language shifted from house to house, but the pattern held. The people were sleeping in conditioned air and still waking as if something had fed on them all night. In a weathered home outside Lafayette, a retired civil engineer and church deacon named Samuel Voss had been keeping notebooks for years. Heat, rain, respiratory complaints, crop stress, water taste, overnight fatigue, strange irritability. He was not a mystic and he was not a performer. But when enough people began describing the same invisible exhaustion, he wrote one line across the top of a clean page. The South is not merely getting hotter. It is becoming harder to live inside. And for the first time, that sentence frightened even him. There is a kind of southern heat people understand. It is harsh, inconvenient, and deeply familiar. It lives in church parking lots after Sunday service, on high school football fields at sunset, in screened porches, truck cabs, and humid backyards where people drink sweet tea and wait for evening to become merciful. It can exhaust the body, but it still belongs to an old rhythm. People know how to talk about it. They joke about it. They endure it. And when the sun finally drops, they expect some measure of release. What disturbed Samuel Voss was the growing sense that release had stopped coming. The heat was no longer just daytime punishment. It was beginning to act like a constant occupation. Nights no longer restored. Mornings no longer reset. People cooled the air around them but could not seem to cool whatever pressure had settled inside them. They lowered thermostats, upgraded systems, changed filters, bought better units, and sealed their homes more tightly. Yet they still woke exhausted, short-tempered, and inwardly scorched. It was as if the body had entered a fight the mind could not remember. Science had language for pieces of it. Urban heat retention, humidity loading, polluted air mass behavior, poor overnight recovery, thermal stress amplified by concrete, asphalt, development, and lost green cover. Every one of those explanations mattered, and Voss never dismissed them, but he believed they left something important untouched. They described mechanism. They did not fully describe experience. And what frightened him most was not only what the instruments showed, it was how quickly ordinary people were learning to call the abnormal normal. That, to him, was the true danger. Adaptation can look like intelligence from the outside. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it is only surrender with better equipment. The South was learning how to endure the new discomfort without asking what it meant. Families were adjusting schedules. Cities were consuming more power. Children were growing up inside sealed interiors. Churches were shortening outdoor events. People were coping. But coping is not the same as healing, and endurance is not the same as safety. By early 2026, Voss had begun to suspect that what people were calling weather was no longer just weather. It was the first stage of a larger misalignment between the body, the land, and the life being built on top of both. At first, most people blamed the sky. That was natural. Heat comes from above, storms from above, drought from above. The instinct is to look upward and stop there. But Samuel Voss had spent too many years studying the Gulf South to make that mistake. He believed the deeper problem was rising from below, not as literal fire, and not in any theatrical sense, but as a long, quiet failure in the land's ability to support life gently. He began writing about recovery. That was his word. The South had always survived pressure. Hurricanes came and went, floods came and went, hard summers came and went. Yet older generations still spoke about the region as something fundamentally alive. Wetlands buffered violence. Shade cooled neighborhoods. Marsh, river, and soil still gave back some of what labor and weather had taken. But now, in many places, the ground itself seemed less generous. Wetlands had been drained, tree cover reduced, waterways polluted. Development spread over once breathing land. Concrete trapped daytime heat and released it through the night. Marshes weakened. Old ecological rhythms thinned. People still lived there, worked there, bought homes there, and raised children there, but the place no longer restored them the way it once had. That change does not remain physical for long. It becomes emotional. Marriage strain rises in tired households. Patience shortens in classrooms, stores, and offices. Small frustrations turn hotter than they should. Tempers become quicker, sleep thinner, and the spirit of a region more brittle. Voss believed that when a place is overused, the people inside it begin carrying the exhaustion of the land, whether they understand it or not. Their nervous systems become the final storage site for stresses the environment can no longer absorb. He was careful not to turn this into mysticism without evidence. He kept one foot in measurable reality. Surface heat, and air quality, water chemistry, paved density, energy load, disrupted ecosystems. But he also believed that science alone could not answer the question people were beginning to ask in whispers. Why does everything feel slightly wrong, even when the systems are still technically working? Why does a cooled room no longer feel like rest? Why does a stable street no longer feel fully calm? Why does ordinary life feel as if it is operating half a step away from some invisible edge? In Voss's notebooks, those questions always led in one direction, toward water. Because once the ground stops giving life back easily, the next crisis usually enters through the bloodstream of the region. For the lower South, water has never been a background detail. It is the structure under the structure. It feeds fields, carries trade, cools cities. Ice supports fisheries, shapes migration, and writes itself into the language of daily life. That is why the shift in the delta disturbed Voss more than the heat. Heat can be argued over. Water cannot. Once water changes character, the region begins telling the truth whether people want to hear it or not. By the spring of 2026, that truth had become harder to avoid. In the lower Mississippi system, more growers were using the same careful words: salinity, intrusion, encroachment, stress. Those were technical words, but no one living near the river heard them as technical anymore. In parts of Plaquemines and St. Bernard, gardens weakened unexpectedly. Smaller citrus plots yellowed. Water lines that had once been trusted began carrying a faint bitterness people could taste before they could explain it. Farmers further inland watched their soil behave differently and started reading extension guidance with the quiet dread people reserve for a diagnosis they do not want confirmed. To Voss, this was one of the cruelest reversals a region could endure. Water everywhere, and less of it usable. Channels full, but crops failing. A landscape built on abundance beginning to learn the emotional language of deprivation. The South has always feared flood, but flood is at least dramatic. Saltwater intrusion is slower, colder, and more humiliating. It enters under the door while people are still speaking the language of ordinary seasons. It turns sweetness bitter by degrees. It teaches people that a place can remain outwardly wet while becoming inwardly unlivable. The first instinct, naturally, was engineering. Pumps, barriers, gates, filtration, emergency draws, portable supply lines, new wells, temporary fixes. Voss never mocked any of that, because adults do what they must to keep a region functioning. But he also kept writing the same warning in different forms. Delay is not repair. A society that confuses temporary control with actual healing is often most vulnerable right when it feels smartest. If the freshwater pulse keeps weakening and salt keeps moving into places that were not built to receive it, then the problem will not remain rural. It will move toward every city that lives off systems most of its residents never think about. And once cities begin depending on broken water logic, the illusion of independence dies very quickly. The most modern parts of a region are often the most forgetful. Baton Rouge, New Orleans, Gulfport, Mobile, and even the outer belt of Houston, places of office towers, distribution systems, data centers, medical campuses, gated neighborhoods, shipping infrastructure, and endless lanes of movement, all create the impression that urban life floats above the old physical realities beneath it. But Samuel Voss never believed that. He thought cities were only as stable as the forgotten systems that kept them fed, cooled, supplied, and watered. That is why he watched urban confidence with growing unease. He knew how dependent city life really was. It depended on rural production, river pressure, storage, transport, treatment systems, marsh protection, labor, road access, and the continued willingness of distant places to remain productive. Break enough of those links quietly, and the city will continue glowing right up until the week it no longer can. The illusion of autonomy survives longest in places most dependent on invisible support. By mid-2026, the pattern was already visible in small ways. Produce was inconsistent. Utility-strained language became more careful. Rural families in stressed parishes began spending longer stretches with relatives inland, not calling it displacement yet, just getting through the season. Water advisories stayed in conversation longer than they used to. People with comfortable jobs in climate-controlled offices started speaking with unusual intensity about things they had once considered background. Where the water came from, whether the deliveries were running on time, why grocery sections felt thinner, why the body still felt worn even when the paycheck had not changed. Voss wrote that cities suffer a particular kind of humiliation in hard years. They discover that confidence is not supply, money is not water, professional identity is not resilience. If enough linked systems weaken at once, the skyline does not save itself. It becomes a monument to how detached comfort had grown from source. This is why he did not romanticize either rural suffering or urban security. He believed both would be tested, only in different ways. Rural communities would feel the wound first. Cities would feel it when the wound stopped staying where it started. And once that happens, weather itself changes meaning. A storm is no longer just a storm. A power strain is no longer just an inconvenience. A bad crop is no longer just bad luck. Everything starts echoing everything else. Heat, water, fatigue, migration, supply, mood. Hot one story, one direction. And once enough people begin sensing that, the sky becomes harder to trust than the ground. There was a time when southern people heard thunder and felt relief before fear. Rain meant release. It meant evening cool down, wet grass, restored gardens, fuller ditches, a break in the long punishment of heat. But by the time Voss reached the middle of his 2026 notes, even rain had changed character. It no longer arrived like mercy. It arrived like contradiction. The heat would sit for days, sometimes weeks, pressing down on subdivisions, parishes, parking lots, fields, and highways, until the land itself seemed to be holding its breath. Then the sky would darken with almost theatrical suddenness. Afternoon would collapse into a bruised electric twilight. Rain would come hard and fast, not cleansing but violent. Mires slamming into pavement so hot that vapor rose immediately back into the air. The sound alone unnerved people. Not the soft drumming of summer rain, but a hard, punishing impact, as if the sky were striking rather than watering. And afterward came the part Voss found hardest to describe. The air did not feel washed. It felt contaminated, heavy in the wrong way, sour, dense, as if heat, runoff, rot, and chemical residue had been lifted together and suspended at breathing height over homes, schools, convenience stores, nursing facilities, and church parking lots. People stepped outside expecting relief and found instead a more intimate discomfort, not the heat of direct sun, but the sensation of inhaling a region under stress. Meteorologists could explain the pieces: heat load, surface release, unstable humidity, runoff chemistry, atmospheric retention. Again, Voss did not reject the science. He simply believed the science had begun describing a moral and civilizational condition as much as a physical one. The South was losing rhythm. Rain came at the wrong time, with the wrong texture, doing the wrong kind of work. Crops failed after surviving drought. Mold spread faster in sealed homes. Tempers rose in classrooms and at kitchen tables. The body never fully reset. This was the point where Voss's warning deepened. Once heaven and earth stop seeming to cooperate, people stop experiencing weather as weather. They begin experiencing it as a message. Not because every storm is supernatural, but because a region under enough strain can feel, with frightening clarity, that its old harmony has been broken. And when the atmosphere itself starts reinforcing that feeling, the next danger no longer comes only from outside. It begins forming between people. Most social breakdown does not begin with ideology. It begins with a line at a store, a line at a pharmacy, a line at a water point, a line where too many worried people realize the supply behind the counter is smaller than the fear in the room. Samuel Voss believed that if the South entered a truly hard season, the first visible moral test would not be in politics. It would be in distribution. At first, the changes would appear manageable. A produce section thinner than usual, bottled water limits after another bad advisory, ice running short in some stores, delivery times becoming irregular, families from lower parishes arriving to stay with relatives inland for a while. Then the emotional tone would shift. What had been inconvenience would become uncertainty. And what had been uncertainty would harden into competition. Voss was unsentimental about this part. He did not believe comfort automatically makes people cruel, but he believed prolonged comfort can make people morally unprepared for scarcity. The professional class, in particular, suffers a special shock when money stops functioning as immediate control. Bank balance, salary, retirement account, home value, all the clean numbers that usually create the feeling of security, suddenly mean less if the truck does not arrive. The tap pressure fails, the road floods, the medicine is delayed, or the shelves stay empty long enough for memory to shift. A person does not need to be poor to feel panic. They only need to learn that access is no longer guaranteed. But that is when neighborhoods begin changing face. The wave does not need to hit a city directly for fear to alter its posture. Doors close earlier. Strangers become suspicious. Generosity turns hesitant. Two neighbors can stand in the same aisle looking at the same last case of water and feel, beneath all politeness, the first cold approach of something older than civic behavior. Hunger, Voss wrote, changes the face faster than fear does, because fear can still be discussed. Hunger simplifies everything. By late 2026, in his worst-case vision, the South would not yet be a movie ruin. It would be something psychologically harder to bear, a recognizable world behaving under unfamiliar moral pressure. That is why he stopped talking only about collapse and started talking about sorting. Hard seasons reveal what people have stored inside themselves when the visible systems begin to fail. Not what they claim to value, what they actually live by when scarcity narrows the room. And if 2026 kept moving in the direction he feared, that sorting would not remain symbolic for long. What made Samuel Voss credible to the people who listened was that he rarely sounded dramatic. He sounded tired, precise, and painfully coherent. He did not predict one giant event that would explain everything. He described a region being worn down in the same direction by many linked pressures, the body exhausted by nights that no longer healed, the land overheated and overbuilt, fresh water weakening, salt moving inward, rain turning hostile, rural systems straining first, urban confidence cracking second, and social life becoming thinner under the pressure of all of it. That picture was harder to dismiss than any single catastrophe. One storm can be written off. One failed crop can be blamed on timing. One season of bad sleep can be chalked up to age, stress, or headlines. But when enough systems begin failing in the same direction, the region begins to feel older than it should, weaker than it admits, and strangely unable to recover from the very pressures it once absorbed, almost by instinct. That, to Voss, was the real significance of 2026. It was not the year the South necessarily died. It was the year it risked becoming unable to lie to itself. He wrote often about false normalcy. Lawnmowers still running, school buses still moving, people still commuting, refinancing homes, scrolling at night, ordering takeout, planning vacations, and pretending the future remained fundamentally shaped like the recent past. That was the image that haunted him most. Not dramatic collapse, but orderly denial. A culture going through the motions of stability while the deeper exchange between land, water, body, and conscience was already changing underneath it. That was why he believed the hardest part of 2026 would not be physical pain alone. It would be recognition. The moment enough people realize that what they called temporary has become structural, that what they called inconvenience has become a condition, that what they called adaptation may actually have been surrender. A region can survive tremendous hardship if it still knows what it is. But once it loses the ability to name what is happening honestly, every hardship enters more deeply. This is where Voss's notebooks begin turning away from diagnosis and toward judgment. Not the theatrical kind, but the steady moral kind. If the South had become physically strained, socially brittle, and spiritually undernourished, then the next question was no longer what was happening to it. The next question was what, if anything, could still be rebuilt before the strain hardened into fate. And once that question begins pressing hard enough on a region, prediction matters less than preparation. By the time Samuel Voss reached the final pages of his notebooks, he was no longer writing like a man obsessed with prediction. He was writing like a man trying to preserve what had not yet been taken. That shift mattered. Because once a region enters the kind of instability he had been describing, fear stops being useful very quickly. Fear may wake people for a moment, but it cannot guide a family through a hard season, and it cannot hold a neighborhood together once strain begins to settle into daily life. Something steadier is required. Voss never dismissed practical preparation. In fact, he insisted on it. He told people to store water while they still could, to keep medicine organized, to know which roads flood first, to understand where their food and drinking supply actually came from, and to stop treating local systems as background details beneath notice. Those were not paranoid habits. They were the ordinary disciplines of adults who still respected the world enough to admit it could turn hard without asking permission first. But even then, he believed practical readiness was only half the matter. A house can be stocked and still be weak. A bank account can be stable and still be useless. A family can have batteries, filters, savings, and supplies, and still come apart under pressure if no one inside that house knows how to stay calm, tell the truth, share discomfort, or restrain fear before it turns into blame. That was the part Voss thought modern life had neglected most. The South, in his view, had not only become physically overheated, it had become spiritually overextended, too distracted to listen, too tired to reflect, too dependent on comfort to notice that comfort had begun hollowing out character rather than strengthening it. So his advice became simpler and deeper at the same time. He told people to begin reducing what made them inwardly fragile. Speak more gently at home. Repair old resentments while the season is still soft enough to allow it. No, stop feeding on outrage simply because it offers the illusion of energy. Teach children gratitude before scarcity teaches it more brutally. Waste less. Slow down enough to notice what is still good. Remember that a household is not held together by devices, but by tone, trust, and habits of mercy practiced long before they are urgently needed. That was why Voss kept returning to one quiet image. He said every person carries a lamp inside the chest. Most people do not think about it when life is easy, because bright years allow dim souls to pass unnoticed. But hard years expose the difference. Some people enter them already inwardly exhausted, and every fresh pressure takes more from them than it should. Others carry something steadier, not perfection, but a kind of moral reserve built from prayer, honesty, restraint, neighborliness, forgiveness, and a willingness to live with less vanity than the age demands. In his mind, that inner reserve was not ornamental. It was survival of another kind. And by 2026, he believed the difference between those two kinds of people would become painfully clear. Samuel Voss never said the future was fixed. He said it was narrowing. That was the phrase he trusted most, because it held both warning and dignity at the same time. He did not claim that every fear would unfold exactly as imagined, or that every county, town, or family would suffer the same way. He knew life was not that simple, but he believed the margin for denial was getting smaller, and that was enough to demand seriousness. The South could no longer afford to treat unnatural exhaustion, failing water, unstable weather, damaged soil, and social tension as separate inconveniences. They were becoming one story, and that, in the end, was the real warning. Not merely that the air felt wrong, or that the delta was changing, or that heat no longer behaved like something people could laugh off and endure. The deeper warning was that a whole region might keep drifting toward hardship while still telling itself that comfort, technology, and habit would somehow make up the difference. Voss thought that was the last illusion to fall. A society does not become strong because it has more systems. It becomes strong because enough people inside it still know how to live truthfully when systems begin to strain. That is why he refused to end in spectacle. He did not want panic. He did not want theatrical despair. He wanted people to understand that difficult years do not only destroy, they reveal. They reveal what was weak, what was neglected, what was falsely trusted, and what still has enough weight to endure. A bad year can expose a culture's sickness, but it can also expose the few living things inside that culture still worth protecting. In his view, that was the hidden mercy inside all real warning. It gives people a final chance to become different before events do the teaching for them. So if 2026 does become the kind of year he feared, the real dividing line may not be wealth, status, or even geography. It may be much quieter than that. It may be found in the family that learned how to speak honestly before pressure arrived, in the neighbor who became dependable before need made dependence unavoidable. Thus, in the child who was taught gratitude before scarcity made gratitude painful, in the household that kept some inner stillness alive while the world outside became hotter, louder, and harder to trust. That is where this story should end. Not in doom and not in false reassurance, but in the recognition that change is still possible while the warning remains only a warning. The South may yet face a harder season. The water may worsen. The air may grow heavier. The body may keep telling the truth long before public life is ready to hear it. But even now, something can still be rebuilt. It begins at the dinner table, in the church hall, along the neighborhood block, and on the parish road. It lives in the hand that still turns on a faucet with gratitude, in the apology made before time runs out, in the appetite restrained before it hardens into ruin, and in the small inner light a person refuses to let go dark. That is where this story ends. Not with panic, not with spectacle, but with the kind of responsibility that comes from seeing clearly while there is still time to change. If this message stayed with you, subscribe to the channel, Leave your thoughts in the comments and share this video with someone who still believes that hard years do not only test a people, they reveal what in them is still worth saving.